Good morning. Always remember to press the button first. Good morning. We're going to get our second day session started, and first of all, I want to thank you for your commitment to our convening here, because we had a huge attendance and people seemed very engaged with the sessions and rapt attention. And to me, the best part was hearing people saying, I have new ideas that I'm bringing back home. So I'm very gratified to hear that. We've got a great day today, and John Bravacos is going to kick it off for us. John is an old hand, and that is a compliment, and a wise head. He has played many roles at HUD, currently as the Special Advisor to Public and Indian Housing at HUD. John was also overseeing the task force of the new Section 3 rule, which will have great interest to folks not only in the Housing Authority world, but in the employment and work readiness world. John, we hope you will read our latest report on post-secondary education carefully, and we can talk more about the recommendations. And with that note, please offer a warm welcome to John Bravacos. I'm sorry, I was instructed, just as I was instructed to push the button, to tell you that unfortunately Hunter Kurtz could not join us, but John, of course, has very large shoes, so here you go. John.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you for giving me another chance to talk to an amazing group of people. I found that I go back almost 20 years now. I was a municipal official in eastern Chester County, a small township called Tredyffrin. We had about 30,000 residents, 12 square miles or so, right by Valley Forge National Historic Park, if any of you are familiar with the area. And one of the things that we had done just as I was coming onto the board was we started televising our board meetings. And the upside of televising them is people who can't get there can see what's going on. And the downside of televising them is that people who want to be seen show up and always have something to offer. So I have a somewhat sensitivity, a small sensitivity to the challenge, to one piece of the challenge that so many of you face, with everybody's willingness to tell you that you're not doing it right. So I appreciate that you persevere and are successful in the face of those challenges. I wanted to say, of course, thank you to Sonia, to Deb, and to CLPHA. I really appreciate the work you do and the willingness you have to share with us a variety of solutions. One of the things I was talking about with Steve Norman earlier was the more we can keep things simple, the more likely it is we're going to be successful. As Sonia had mentioned, I ran the Section 3 task force. The rule is out for comment until June 4th, so I have this. We can't really engage in a conversation about it right now without me taking stenographic notes, and I'm not going to do that. But please read it, please review it, please make sure that your comments, to the extent that you have them, whatever the scope of them is, you share with us, because it's exceedingly important that we understand what we didn't think of and what impact. Many programs are fantastic, and we don't want to disturb those. However, many of the entitlement jurisdictions don't have programs that need them, and that was part of where we're trying to go to for some of the other funding streams that are as part of it. So that's my, I guess, Section 3 piece that I can't let go of, I'm sorry. What they told me I have to tell you is, it's always fun. Well, I really enjoy working for Hunter Kurtz. It's excellent to have the person in charge who's supposed to be in charge. While I have a tremendous amount of respect and have enjoyed working with Dominique Bloom, who knows more about public housing than, well, she's forgotten more than I'll ever know, but and she's got that integrative mindset of how it all ties together. Hunter's the decider now. And instead of me trying to say, well, maybe this, maybe that, I don't know, Hunter's there and making the decisions. And happily he listens carefully to those people who know what they're talking about. That's, Dominique and DJ and a variety of the other folks. But he also considers the broader picture. And his experience in Detroit, his experience at HUD before, have all helped inform him in that same tone of let's keep it as simple as we can and let's stay focused on the goal. And the goal is nobody without a roof. People in the healthiest environments they can be in, and a path to self-sufficiency. And if we can combine those and find the fastest and easiest ways to combine them so that the residents that we spend our days worrying about have the freedom to make the decisions that they need to make their lives the lives they want. So for a lot of us, this is about freedom. It's how do you ensure that they have those freedoms? Towards that end, the administration is, the Opportunity Zone process is underway. The White House Opportunity Zone and Revitalization Council has, as its executive director, someone out of our PIH office. So it's going to be moving forward, and we're hopeful that we'll hear plenty of commentary about where we're going in the right path and where we might not be. I think you've heard about Inspire, the change in REACT to a rational, well, the change in REACT to an inspection program that makes sense and pays attention to what's going on within the units themselves, and making certain that that you've got a healthy home to live in. Thank you. I have a large piece of what I end up doing is working with NYCHA, which is a fascinating experience. I've never been around anything so big, and I find it somewhat, it's both intimidating and intoxicating. But big doesn't always mean good, although NYCHA is doing a tremendous job of working toward a realistic series of solutions to improve what's going on there. But it was the lead that started this engagement this time around. So don't miss that it was the lead. One other item they'd asked that I discuss is carbon monoxide. I think we've had 4 people die in subsidized housing so far this year. That's 4 more than we should have. That's going to precipitate legislation. It's precipitating a fair amount of effort on our part to find ways to make sure that we're paying attention to carbon monoxide in those communities where local government hasn't stepped up and made certain that you have carbon monoxide if you have open flame appliances. So those are, I think, kind of the big pieces. March 22nd, we published the voluntary conversion notice. And as you are certainly aware, we remain committed to improving the conditions of the residents. And when repositioning is the best solution, repositioning is the solution we'd love to help you do. If there's other solutions that we, HUD, can do, by all means let us know. We're working on streamlining waiver processes and having an impact on smoothing some of the bumps that tend to face you on a regular basis. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm hopeful that we can make things simpler, we can make things better, we can make sure that people have healthy homes to live in, and we can leave the place better than we found it. So thank you, and I appreciate it very much.
Good morning, everybody. How is everybody feeling? Oh my gosh, please wake me up. All right, give me a good morning. Thank you. Well, welcome to the second day of our conference. Guys, this is just an amazing event. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces. I'm happy to see new faces. I hope you guys are all enjoying the sessions, both our plenaries and breakouts. If you like what you're seeing, or if you don't like what you're seeing, put them in your evaluations. This is my plug to say, if you haven't filled out your evaluation forms, this is really important for us as a conference to grow and evolve. There's a couple things that changed from last year because of the evaluations. One, we made the breakout sessions longer, from 60 minutes to 75 minutes, because people wanted more time to engage and ask questions. Another thing that we're going to be doing this morning that's different is we have small group discussions that are very informal. They're really meant to be networking sessions, connect with your peers, really kind of get in the details of things that maybe in other sessions you didn't get to ask the question or you didn't get to share your ideas. The hour after our keynote this morning is an opportunity to do that and really connect with your colleagues across the country. So I'm really excited that we were able to do that this year, and we brought it because all of you wanted that from last year. The other note I'll make is that after the summit, we'll be sending out a post-summit email. It'll have the slides from this entire conference. I saw a lot of people taking pictures, and that's always good. But you can also download them afterward. And all the webcasting that we do is also recorded, so you'll also be able to look back on the videos if you didn't get to a session that was in the middle space here. You can watch those again. Now, the last thing, I wish I could say we're giving away an iPad, but we just have one at the Lost and Found. Is it Greg? All right, well, Greg's the winner. It's his iPad, but he's the winner. And Albra will give you your iPad now.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the one I left.
Yeah, what apps do you have on it? How do we know it's yours? Yeah, he's a board member. We gotta say yes.
You know what? I almost erased it remotely.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and I didn't even realize until this morning. I was saying, what the heck? And of course, as you get older, you think, well, you know, I'm drifting off.
I think it's a sign we're good at logistics here. I think it's a sign it's a very strong event. I also wanted to just briefly, before we move on with the program, just give attention to the theme for today. Yesterday, our theme was ending generational poverty, which is obviously an aspirational goal, and we're all trying to work toward that. Today is no less ambitious, addressing systemic disparities. I think what we were trying to do with this day is really zoom out. These partnerships can be really complicated, and you get in the weeds, you get stuck, you also overcome those things. But the cross-sector work we do is in a greater context. And my background is in public health, and how I think of this is you can't really talk about public health without talking about health disparities. You can't talk about health disparities without talking about racial disparities. You can't talk about racial disparities without talking about racism. So I think what we're trying to do today is really bring the conversation outward and more inward. And we're really thrilled to have Dr. Jones starting off the conversation today. And I'll leave it there.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Karen Du Bois Walton. I'm the president of Elm City Communities in New Haven, Connecticut, and we are a proud CLPHA member. I'm trying something new here. I work with a lot of young people, and they write out their speeches, and I say, aren't you going to print it out? And they say, no, they just do it off their device. So I want to see how this works. I'm doing it off my device. All right, so we're thrilled to be here to present about our cross-sector collaborations and also to learn from other agencies around the country. Working with education and health sectors is key to our ability to serve our residents' most urgent needs. Housing is inextricably linked to other systems and programs that provide opportunity, encouragement, and care. As those of us in this room also know, these systems don't always work together seamlessly, and there are gaps in the safety nets in communities across this country. Sometimes these are systems failures, but other times these breakdowns are symptomatic of larger, more historical forces that restrict access, constrict opportunity, and even do tremendous harm. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing a renowned scholar, activist, and medical practitioner who's brought these larger forces into the conversations about the social determinants of health. Dr. Camara Jones, this morning's keynote speaker, is a family physician and epidemiologist whose work focuses on the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of this nation. She seeks to broaden the national health debate to include not only universal access to high-quality health care, but also attention to the social determinants of health, including poverty, and the social determinants of equity, including racism. As a methodologist, she's developed new methods for comparing full distributions of data rather than simply comparing means or proportions in order to investigate population-level risk factors and propose population-level interventions. As a social epidemiologist, her work on race-associated differences in health outcomes goes beyond documenting those differences to vigorously investigating the structural causes of those differences. As a teacher, her allegories on race and racism illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for too many Americans to understand or discuss. Dr. Jones is currently a senior fellow at the Satcher Health Leadership Institute, an adjunct professor at the Rollins School of Public Health, and an adjunct associate professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine. She's also the past president of the American Public Health Association. This morning, she will shed new light in the role of cross-sector collaboration in addressing systemic disparities and remind us of our role in reimagining systems so that they better serve those in need. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones to the Housing Is Summit.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I am delighted to be at this Housing Is Summit because I'm a health person. And just the amazing thing to be a health person here at this housing-based summit with education and so many other sectors is an amazing opportunity. I want to share with you some tools, if you will, for naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. You heard that I was a past president of the American Public Health Association. That was 3 years ago. And in that role, I launched for our association a national campaign against racism. That was my presidential initiative, if you will. And in that, I wanted to engage as many other organizations, community sectors as would join us. And there are actual things that are happening as a result of my effort 3 years ago. Maybe today we will add CLPHA and other sector partners to that effort. But that national campaign against racism has 3 tasks: to name racism, to ask, how is racism operating here so that we can identify levers on which to act, and then to organize and strategize to act. So I'm starting here, and this is where I'm going to end. But in between, I'm going to share with you some of my stories, a cartoon animation, my allegories, some definitions, some frameworks, so that you feel not only inspired but equipped to engage, especially in naming racism. Some of you who were here yesterday know that I almost burst out of my skin, because as we talk around these issues, it's important for us to name racism, because if we don't say that word in the context of widespread denial of the continued existence of racism, we're complicit with that denial. So the first tool I'm going to share with you is actually not straight on racism at all. This is a tool that I use when I'm speaking to health audiences. I'm going to speak my tool to you as health, but then of course you'll be able to make the bridges, and I'll also come back and make it a housing framework, okay? But this is to help us understand different levels of health intervention, if you will. I call this my cliff analogy, and here we go. Whoops! Boom! Somebody just fell off of the cliff of good health. And if that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance there at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about other people who might come along that cliff face, so if we were concerned about population health, public health, community health, we might well ask ourselves, what could we put in place as a health intervention besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom of the cliff? So somebody's going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down. That way, even if people fall, we could catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. And that's clearly an excellent idea. Although the more you think about it, nets do have holes in them. So some people might fall through the cracks. But never mind that, we could even make that a trampoline halfway down the cliff. No holes in a trampoline. But even if that were a trampoline halfway down, we might find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could we put in place as a health or housing? I know already you're thinking housing, right? But as a health or housing intervention, well, clearly we need to have a fence. Oops. Have to have a fence at the edge of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But even that fence has to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else could we do as a health intervention? Well, we could move the population away from the edge of the cliff. So let me label these interventions that I have depicted so far, where the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff represents acute medical care and what we describe as tertiary prevention. So on the public health side of things, we talk about 3 levels of prevention: primary, secondary, tertiary. Tertiary prevention is preventing complications from disease that's already manifest. So that's preventing amputations from diabetes and the like. That's your ambulance. The net or trampoline halfway down, these are our safety net programs, which are often in our social services, as well as secondary prevention, which is early detection, screening, which could be in clinical settings. I'm still staying health, but then I'm going to broaden to housing, but I know you guys are already thinking housing and education and the like. But anyway, so they could be in our clinical settings, so, screening for breast cancer and the like, or they could even be in community settings. The fence at the edge of the cliff, that's primary prevention, keeping bad things from happening in the first place. So on the health side of things, that could be immunizations or what we call anticipatory guidance, letting young parents know what to expect with their children, or even policy interventions, like a tobacco 21 policy, so that we prevent easy access of young people to tobacco products. Moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is what we, on the health side of things, describe as addressing the social determinants of health. That's when we start thinking about addressing housing and education and the like, because we define these social determinants of health as the determinants of health and illness that are outside of the individual. So they're beyond our individual genes, and they're beyond our individual behaviors. And they are, in fact, the contexts of our lives. So that includes individual context, which is individual education, occupation, income, wealth. So addressing poverty is a very important way of addressing the social determinants of health, moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. They include neighborhood context. So here you guys come in squarely. So it includes what is the quality of housing and the availability of affordable housing in a given neighborhood. What are the quality of the schools? Are there jobs in a neighborhood? And even if there aren't jobs right there, is there transportation to a job? Can people get fresh fruits and vegetables in a given neighborhood, or do they instead live in what some people call a food desert or other people call a fast food swamp, right? Can people walk 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week in their neighborhood? Is it safe? Are there street lights? What's the relationship of police officers to people walking in your neighborhood? And on and on and on. So addressing adverse neighborhood conditions is another way of what we describe as addressing the social determinants of health. So clearly, for health people, then when you start moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, that's clearly where it becomes clear that, that's outside of our sector, and that's where we really need this intersectoral collaboration and partnership. And we are starting to talk about this a lot, right? Let me go back, though, to the cliff and say, if we were thinking about a health intervention or a health outcome like infant mortality, babies who die before their first birthday, right? The ambulance might be our neonatal intensive care units. The net or trampoline might be prenatal care, screening pregnant women to identify problems early. The fence might be women's, infants, and children programs, our WIC programs to have excellent maternal nutrition. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff might be having a living wage in neighborhoods, or having excellent schools so that young girls don't feel that their only option is to have babies too soon. If you were talking about housing, when you fall off the edge of the cliff, that's homelessness. The net in the housing context might be shelters. The fence, I think, are all the people in this room, these are our public housing authorities, to keep people from falling off that edge. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is creating affordable housing options and the like, as well as now you recognize it's also, House Ed, or, SOAR, Project SOAR, so the housing intervening with other sectors to create opportunities, including in health and all. So we see where this is. Now, so it's a lovely framework, right? We could have a conversation with any community saying, how should we be spending our health resources? How should we be spending our housing resources, our education resources? How much on ambulances at the bottom of the cliff versus nets versus fence versus moving the population away from the edge of the cliff? But as useful as this framework could be, as I've presented it so far, it has a huge fatal flaw. And that huge fatal flaw is that it does not yet equip us to talk about how health or housing or educational disparities arise. So I want you to keep the cliff in the back of your mind. We're going to shift gears for just a moment, and then we'll come back to the cliff. But we're going to shift gears to think about, how do disparities arise? And especially when we're talking about health disparities, and especially when we're talking about racial ethnic health disparities, which are the most profound and long-lasting and across organ systems and age groups and across the ages, we unfortunately have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. The Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, way back in 2002, I can say way back now, right, released what was then a ground-shaking report. It's Unequal Treatment Report, which pulled together hundreds of studies documenting that even for people in the same healthcare system, everybody in the VA system, everybody covered by Medicare or Medicaid, everybody in this hospital system, there would be very well documented differences, for example, in how vigorously your chest pain might be investigated or treated, depending on your race. Or differences in how much pain medication you might get if you walked into an emergency department with a long bone fracture, depending on your ethnicity or your race. But that panel that wrote that report and documented these differences in the quality of healthcare received within the healthcare system by race said that's not the end-all and be-all of how racial health disparities arise, because they recognize some people can't access healthcare in the first place. So that's a second level at which health disparities arise, right? But then I'm hoping that everybody in this room recognizes that health is not created within the health sector. So the third huge level at which health disparities arise are differences in the conditions of our lives. Differences in our life opportunities, exposures, and stresses, which are making some individuals and communities sicker than others in the first place. And when you think about these three levels at which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, and differences in underlying exposures and opportunities, you see, I sort of drew it as a pyramid, right? Or better yet, I think we need to understand it as an iceberg, where the huge hidden base are the differences in the conditions of our lives. And then the same people who've been made sicker are often frustrated because of limited access to the healthcare system. And then even the lucky ones who get into the healthcare system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. Now, you make your analogies to housing, education, but I'm still speaking as a health person. Thank you very much. Okay, but you're tracking with me, right? Right. So now, recognizing these three levels at which health disparities arise, we're going to go back to the cliff. But now we are going to recognize that we are not dealing with a flat, two-dimensional cliff, but actually we are dealing with a three-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there might be an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance has a flat tire, so it's slow or goes off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all. And maybe there's no net nor fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now let me label these observations about our three-dimensional cliff with how health disparities arise, where the differences in quality of care are represented when there's an ambulance there, but it's slower, it goes off in the wrong direction. Differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence. And differences in underlying exposures and opportunities are represented by the closer proximity of that greeny population to the edge. So now that we recognize that we really are dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, there's a whole new set of questions that arise. The first question, of course, is how did the cliff become three-dimensional? And that's usually because of historical injustices that are perpetuated by present-day contemporary structural factors. But given that the cliff is three-dimensional, we also need to ask, why are there differences in how resources are distributed along that cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the oranges back there in a way and the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when you start asking and addressing those kinds of questions, we are now doing something that differs from addressing the social determinants of health, which I described as moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like. When we start trying to figure out about systems of power that can distribute resources and populations differentially, we're now talking about the social determinants of equity or inequity, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, economic systems like capitalism, and the like. So now, I have distilled, if you will, 3 different dimensions of health or housing or educational intervention, right? 1 dimension, of course, is a line, 2 dimensions is a flat plane, 3 dimensions is space. Well, along the line at the edge of the cliff is where we can display all of our curative and preventive health services or educational services or housing services and the like, right? That ambulance, net, and fence. And on the health side of things, you know, if we say the word health in this country, that's immediately people go to health services or health care, right? They'll complete that thought for you. And this is where the Affordable Care Act is, this whole discussion of trying to maintain, trying to expand, trying to get to Medicare for all. This is where even when we do get to universal access to high-quality health care, that's still going to be an edge-of-the-cliff conversation. That's not to say that's not an important effort. We must get to universal access to high-quality health care because that is how a civilized society values all of its people equal. We must get to universal quality housing for all of our people. We must guarantee excellent public education for all of our children because that's how a civilized society values all of its people equally. But even when we get to universal access to high-quality health care, that in and of itself is not going to result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or the elimination of health disparities because you can overwhelm any system if everybody's pushed up against the edge. So we must move into that 2nd dimension, which is about addressing the social determinants of health. I can display that in a flat plane, about addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, and the like, moving the population away from the edge of the cliff if we want to have large and sustained improvements in health outcomes. But the trick there is that if we are about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff without recognizing that we are really dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, we are at risk of moving some of the population, but not all of the population, and actually making health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge and address the 3-dimensionality of the cliff. We need to address the social determinants of equity or inequity, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and the like, if we want to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. Now, if I had all the time in the world, or my usual 2 hours that I ask for, which they didn't give me, so don't worry. Then we could stop here, right? And we could have a long conversation, but we're not going to do that, right? I'm just going to say 2 more things about this. I guess the first thing is that along any of the edge of any of our cliffs, that's where we have integration of services, right? So for health, that's integration, behavioral health, and, you know, and primary care or oral health into that. That's along in a sector you have integration. You start talking about intersectoral collaboration or partnership, when you get into that 2nd dimension, all of us need each other to move the population away from the edge of the cliff. You start talking about inclusion in decision-making processes when you start acknowledging and addressing the 3-dimensional cliff. Who is at the table and who's not? What's on the agenda and what's not? Because the mechanisms of these systems of structured inequity, these social determinants of equity, are in our decision-making processes. The structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. Where structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making. Who's at the table, who's not. What's on the agenda, what's not. Policies, the written how of decision-making. Practices and norms, the unwritten how of decision-making. And values, the why. I'll come back to that if I give myself enough time. But usually at this time, with the general audience, I also say, you know, I've said the word racism 2 or 3 times, nobody fell off their chair, so let's go. So now, so this is how I ease people into a conversation about racism, right? Okay, so are you eased? You eased? Okay. So now, before I define racism, which does beg a definition so that we all know what we're talking about, I want to tell you a story that is going to illustrate how racism works. So you have a really deep understanding, then we'll come to a definition. So this story was actually based on my experience as a medical student. I was, of course, a very studious medical student. One Saturday, I was, studying with some of my friends in my apartment. We were studying long and hard, and it got late. We got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment, which was typical. So my friends understood, but that's all right. We decided to go into town and try to find something to eat. So we go into town, we find a restaurant. We walk in, we sit down, menus are presented, we order our food. Food is served, here we are eating. Not a very remarkable or insight-producing story yet, because most of us have had this kind of experience, right? But as I sat there with my friends eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and that sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've intrigued you. Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Okay, so what did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now I know I've lost most of you. That's all right, hang in with me, okay? Sign said open. If I hadn't thought anything more about it, here I am sitting, eating, look at see a sign that says open. I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that now, because of the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed. And that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And that's when I understood how racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it's difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except on the health side of things, we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? Yet those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who say, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's actually an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act, so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, you could even talk to the restaurant owner, who is, after all, inside with you, and you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Let's open up the door and let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you're doing is trying to pass food through the door, or trying to break the glass, or tear down the sign, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So when I have 5 minutes to give people a taste of what I mean when I'm talking about racism, it is that two-sided or multi-sided sign, and the door and the lock, all of that, all the structural piece, right, that is creating dual or multi-sided realities in our society. Now again, if I had all the time in the world, I've actually had the experience starting a talk with this, then throwing out the question, how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of the sign? And having a 3-hour community conversation about that. We never moved off of that. So I'm not going to ask you to respond to that question, but there are many, many ways to know. So you can think that question. I'm going to move now to defining racism. And when I say the word racism, I'm clear that I'm talking about a system. So I'm not talking about a personal moral failing or individual character flaw or even, a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. I'm talking about a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of both structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? On what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. So I just want to tell you, I know probably in this room I don't have to convince anybody that race is not biology, right? But still we sort of think that race is a real thing. Race is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. Here in Washington, D.C., you look at me and I am clearly black. In some parts of Brazil, you look at me, I am just as clearly white. In South Africa, you look at me, I am just as clearly colored. Here I am, same physical appearance. The social interpretation of my appearance in those three settings would assign me to three different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, my health outcome would probably take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all of those places. And it's not just because I'm a light-skinned black woman that that's true. For every single person sitting in this room, there is some other place on this earth where your so-called race is different than what you are living at here today. So you just need to travel to try that out, okay? But that's true for all of us. So if race is the social interpretation of how one looks, racism is the system that operates on that so-called race to do two things, to structure opportunity and to assign value. What are the impacts of racism? Well, when we do think or talk about racism at all, we understand that racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities, and that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country. And that's because it makes some people, especially some white people, uncomfortable. And I used to say when I was in audiences with lots of people who were living as white, I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. So if you feel uncomfortable, shake it off, stay with me. I'm going to tell some more stories. We can all do this. But now what I really need to say is, if you feel uncomfortable, lean in, because the edge of our comfort is our growing edge for all of us. But however you deal with it, we recognize, okay, there's a system that's both unfairly disadvantaging and unfairly advantaging different individuals and communities, but there's a third impact of racism that many of us overlook. And that is how racism is sapping the strength of our whole society through the waste of human resources. There are many examples of that. For example, when we as a nation are not vigorously investing in the full excellent public education of all of our children because the blinders of racism have made some people think there's no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. We know there is genius in all of our communities, and if we were to only fully and vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. Might already be up on Mars farming, if that were a good idea, right? But we wouldn't even have to go to Mars. We could be dealing with the problems in our communities today if we were to invest in all of that genius. These same blinders that don't value all of us equally have made many of us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. And if you know folks who are either stuck in the system or cycling in and out, and I know public housing authorities are trying to do something about that cycling, right? I mean, we all have a role in this. We need to do something about the disproportionate incarceration. We need to do something about how we welcome our returning citizens. But anyway, if you know these people who are involved in this system, there are many, many geniuses caught up in this system that if there had only been some other way, could be contributing quite productively to our society. So actually, that point about how racism saps the strength of our whole society is the one that I think we need to take up most urgently right now in these times. We need to have more media stories about that. We need to have more data collection. We need to have more conversations around our dinner tables about how racism is sapping the strength of the whole society so that more people will be filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So before I get off of this slide, one more thing, which is this whole issue of, talking about unfair disadvantage and unfair advantage. I bumped up against that when I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, my last few years there. I had somebody who told me I needed to change my slides and take that unfairly advantages other individuals and communities off of my slide. And wow, so the compromise until I left CDC behind that was that he said, well, if you took the words unfairly off, you can talk about both the disadvantage and the advantage. But what that interaction taught me is that there are many people in this country who think that there is disadvantaged and normal. Right? Disadvantaged and normal. And the reason that people think that is that we as a nation are ahistorical, and people do not understand that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. So now I'm going to shift and talk about 3 levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. I started thinking about these levels of racism to try to answer the question, how could racism turn into differences in health outcomes, like differences in obesity prevalence between populations, or the numbers of our babies dying before their first birthday, or the numbers of our mothers dying in childbirth-related deaths, or the differences in cancer deaths, and on and on. And not only does it help us understand how racism can turn into health outcomes, it also helps us understand what we can do. And as you will see, it also helps us understand how racism can turn into housing outcomes, education outcomes, all of it, right? Because I would just say that racism is not a single sector force, right? So we can all agree on that. So let me define each of these levels very briefly. I'm going to illustrate them with another one of my teaching stories, The Gardener's Tale, and then we'll carry on. Who's heard The Gardener's Tale in this room? Oh, I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Okay, so first definitions of the levels of racism, and then my Gardener's Tale. So institutionalized racism is this system, if you will, the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values which taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws, customs, background, norms. It shows up as the inherited disadvantage or the reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions and access to power. So for example, differences in access to quality housing by race, or differences in access to excellent educational opportunities, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly, those things impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment, and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. And in terms of power, differential access to power as information, could be health information or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board. And power as voice in media, government, and the like. Now, because I'm going to be very sparing with my time, I'm just going to briefly hit a question that often comes up for me when people see this slide and they say, Dr. Jones, excuse me, would you look at that top point in your examples? Housing, education, employment, income. Isn't that what we call social class? Right? Dr. Jones, are you talking about racism, or are you really, really talking about social class? That's an important question that many of you in this room might need me to answer, right? So my answer starts with the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized, stigmatized, oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land and the near genocide and moving the survivors to reserve lands, reservations. And then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them somewhere else. You know, we could talk about people who for centuries lived in Mexico who never crossed the border crossed them, and then they found themselves in New Mexico, right? and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still being harassed. We have a very interesting relationship with migrant labor. So starting with Chinese laborers unable by law. So the Chinese laborers came to build our railroads, right? Unable by law to bring their families, unable by law to marry. We have many people dependent still on migrant labor from Mexico and Central and South America, right? Where in Georgia, with all this stuff, this anti-immigrant feeling going on, it's like the Georgia growers are like, who's going to pick our strawberries? Who's going to pick our peaches, right? But we never invest in their housing or education or health or whatever. We have the Japanese Americans who were interred in World War II. Did you ever wonder why they didn't not inter, because that's bury. They didn't bury them, intern. Why they didn't intern the German Americans or the Italian Americans, right? For people, so you could pick up all, the Micronesian islands where we did the atomic, so there are lots of historical injustices. For people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny, for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people hear me talking like that and they go, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go, talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. Right? But Dr. Jones, don't you recognize that the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865? And we're now in 2019, which makes that 154 years ago. Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase is in the question, all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as present-day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and each of those other initial historical injustices. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So when you ask me, am I talking about racism or am I really talking about social class? My answer is that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And that is a very important aha. Now, if I could talk for another 20 minutes on this slide. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction, lack of action in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So that's what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination, right? Some people call this interpersonal racism. I call it personally mediated racism, which is quite a mouthful, but that's because I'm still understanding racism as a system. And this is the system mediated through people. How could it impact health or anything else? Well, I can't go into detail on all of these things, but police brutality, physician disrespect, physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient couldn't afford, wouldn't understand, wouldn't comply, or whatever they assume. That's the subtle part of that. Or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse. But shopkeeper vigilance, waiter disrespect, there's just the kind of microaggressions, if you will, teacher devaluation. And like institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, right? But also, personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I'm defining here from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Now, I also agree that, some of my friends who do anti-racism training say, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? I agree, it is. I haven't put it on my slide yet, and I hadn't for a long time because I didn't understand how an internalized sense of entitlement could turn into bad health outcomes. Although now, maybe I'm understanding that a sense of entitlement thwarted might turn into, the opioid epidemic or the suicide thing, or even voting against your own interest. Okay, so I said that, and you can just put, right? But, and I actually just became aware of a book called Dying from Whiteness or something like that. So I haven't read it yet, that I might need to read. But here, the rest of the slide is still from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where the internalized sense of less is making us feel, the self-devaluation. Maybe I shouldn't even try to graduate from high school or apply to that college, or live in that neighborhood, or try to get that job. The white man's ISIS colder syndrome is a manifestation. That phraseology comes from my parents' generation. What it meant then for people of color, it still means for many of us today. So say I'm black and I need a lawyer. You know what? I might actually seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or say I'm sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the black doctor. In fact, if my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Internalized racism turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, and really it's about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when you hear young high school students of color, for example, and one of them's trying to be the valedictorian and the friends are teasing her or him by saying, well, so-and-so's just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism with my Gardner's tale. This story, like the other one I told you before, was based on my own real life experience. So let me just first tell you what I saw with my own real eyes, and then we're going to make it a story about racism. My husband and I had been married about a year. We were moving down to Baltimore so I could finish my PhD at Hopkins. So we moved to Baltimore, we buy our first freestanding house. Cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And we bought this house in October, so that's really not the time to plant in Baltimore. But that's all right, we held on, and when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, finally ran out with our marigold seeds, gonna decorate our cute little house. And then he ran right back in, because he said, Camara, some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of these boxes are empty. I need to go down to the gardening store. So he does. He goes down to the gardening store, and he hauls back big old bags of potting soil, and then we fill up the empty boxes. Then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds, and we put them in all of the boxes, and we water them all equally. And then, because I'm not the gardener in the family, by this time I'm exhausted, right? So I'm just going to sit back and enjoy, right? So about 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door, and I finally pay attention to these flower boxes. And what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks, because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous-looking plants, and some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil, which my husband had bought, turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in that rich, fertile soil had sprouted. And the strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we found there in those boxes turned out to be poor rocky soil. So that the weak seed planted in the poor rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed in that poor rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. So a few of you guys are nodding. So maybe you're some gardeners out there. And maybe you've composted half of your garden. And maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes. And the image, of course, is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we're going to have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And the gardener has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. That rich, fertile soil, all the red seed is sprouted, strong red seed, tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. The poor, rocky soil, weak pink seed dies. Here comes the strong pink seed struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens, until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized racism works. where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes, keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick this story back up to say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking at the red flowers thinking, oh, red is so beautiful. And then she looks over at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or maybe not even recognizing, understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine, and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers, and then into another pink flower, and to this pink flower, and this flower is like, get away from me, bee, don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start out by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. Not making light of it, but if that is all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. So then you might say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is also good, right? And so we have our workshop. And in the workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in the garden, we must address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for the gardener to keep segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, it means you need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention, you will have also addressed the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink. But when her children grow up seeing the flowers equally beautiful, they would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So the story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we must at least address the institutionalized racism. Good to address all the other levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But I'm not quite finished with this story yet. There is one more question that we need to ask, which is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. Media, foundations, corporations, communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red, that's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can arise out of this story. We do not have time right now for your questions, although maybe in the little groups afterward we can, everybody can discuss some of these things. But I just want to say, I want to share with you two other questions that have come up before, and then if you thought I was talking fast, I'm going to speed through the rest of my presentation. Okay, but once I was asked, excuse me, Dr. Jones, why should the red flowers share their soil? And when I heard that question, I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism that might be otherwise difficult if we were talking about racism between you and me. My answer to the question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. Okay, so we can talk about that too. But here's the second question. Second question is, what if that's not the original gardener we're looking at? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And that great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, there are 3 elements to addressing that question. First, we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution, right? And then as we try to solve it, we have to make those flower boxes transparent. So that's the second part of the answer. We must make the flower boxes transparent. We must talk about the differences in the quality of the soil. And the third part of the answer is, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we also need to be clear that everybody understands the pink seed did not just launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. Right? So we need to talk about history. And we need to talk about the gardener's agency in setting up the whole situation, how her initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. So, you know, I used to be very structural. I used to think this story, for many years I told this story, and it was just about the differences in the quality of the soil, until I understood one day, in the telling of it, actually in the middle of a talk, that even if we were to compel that red gardener to enrich that poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So we must address both the opportunity structure part of racism and the value assignment part of racism. I used to think values was like religion or philosophy. No, it's a very important part of our anti-racism work, and we need to figure out how we address that part too. So now I am going to speed, because I want to at least hit on all of these things in the, I'm not going to look at her anymore. Okay, so we'll be able to do 15 minutes. Okay, but can I keep going with this piece? Okay. So I told you that a national campaign against racism had 3 things: name racism, ask how is racism operating here, and organize and strategize to act. So I have spent most of my time giving you some tools for naming racism. I gave you a definition, I gave you, 2 stories, the open close sign, the gardener's tale, I've given you a why name racism in housing with the cliff analogy. So okay, you got that. So you can name racism, please be strong and be brave in naming racism. But the second and third stages are asking, how is racism operating here? Now that's a legitimate question, because racism is not a cloud, it's not a miasma that we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, where these mechanisms are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which are the elements of decision-making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda, and what's not. And whenever any of us sits at a decision-making table, I encourage us to first look around and say, who is not here at this table who has an interest in this proceeding? And then our job is not just to represent their interests, our job is to find them a way to the table. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. And as I said, we need to address all of these things. We could talk about how is racism operating here in police killings of unarmed black and brown men. And, I've thought about that. How is racism operating here, and how our housing in the HUD budget, or anything. Like, we can think about, like, so you can take this as a real thing and think about all of these elements. But to carry on, I just wanted to talk about health equity and social equity and what is all of that. So I have a 3-part definition of health equity. I'm going to race through it. Health equity is not an outcome like, oh, magically we hit health equity on Sunday. It's a process. It's a process. And it's assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. How do we get there? Achieving health equity requires at least 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources not equally, but according to need. And how is health equity related to health disparities? Health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Disparities are counting the different numbers of different colored bodies at the bottom of the cliff, or the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. Equity is all that stuff that came before. And so on this, I just want to say, if you ever want to figure out, is what I'm doing getting toward health equity, housing equity, social equity, check it against those 3 criteria. Are you valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need? There are at least 5 systemic barriers to achieving health equity in our country, so I'm just going to hit them and go. The first is, we as a nation have a very narrow focus on the individual. It makes our sense of self-interest very narrowly defined. We aren't even thinking about our cousins, right? We're not thinking about, there but for the grace of God go I. We're all in this together. So we don't have a sense of interdependence. We don't even have a sense of collective efficacy. We're like, what can I do, not what can we do? Right? And the most important thing is that when you're narrowly focused on the individual, that makes systems and structures invisible or irrelevant. That's where I was going yesterday with my question. The second of our 5 is that we are ahistorical in this nation. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. And similarly, systems and structures, if you're born and something was this way, you think, oh, it's always been this way, always going to be this way. It makes you not even think you can change things, right? So we have to look at history, to look at the history of change, right? And then the myth of meritocracy, the story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you can make it. Isn't that our Horatio Alger story? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard. Although not everybody who has made it has worked hard. We have some very prominent examples of that right now. Okay? But even understanding that most people who have made it have worked hard, there are many, many, many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and being perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism, and all these other systems of structured inequity. When we deny racism, and you can deny racism in at least 2 ways. You could say, I don't think racism exists anymore. Or you could never say the word racism. Because when you don't say the word racism in the context of widespread denial, you're complicit with that denial. But when you deny racism, then you're endorsing this myth of meritocracy. The 4th is our belief in a zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose. And then, which masks the cost of inequity. When I talk about how racism saps the strength of the whole society, if we're just focused on the unfair disadvantage and the unfair advantage type of thing and that duality, we don't even understand the cost of inequity to all of us. And the fact that we are short-sighted about the future. So we have a total disregard for our children. We don't think in a 7 generations way in which many Native American nations think when they're doing their decision-making. We don't even think, in East Africa, Maasai people greet each other, how are the children? And the answer you want to hear is all the children are well. We aren't even cared about our children, and then when we do care about our children, we think about our children versus their children, and we're not thinking that all children are our children. So anyway, I just wanted to go through these, and I'm almost done. Here's what we can do. So going back to that open-close sign, we need to look for evidence of two-sided signs. We can't just be happy, oh, it looks open to me, right? So we need to shine the bright light of inquiry everywhere on health outcomes, educational outcomes, housing outcomes, and saying, is there something differential going on here by race, by language, by income, by anything, any way you slice and dice it? Is there some kind of two-sided sign going on? We need to burst through our bubbles to experience our common humanity. Very often all of us are in our bubble of our work and our raising our kids and stuff, and very often we do not know that just across town there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who live in very different circumstances. Many of the people in this room do know that because you're working every day with those people, but for most of us, we don't even understand that common humanity in different circumstances. We need to create opportunities to burst through our bubbles. Partner schools across town, or whatever it is, create real opportunities. We need to be interested in the stories of others, and then we need to believe the stories of others, and then we need to join in the stories of others. We need to see the absence of, especially who's at the table and who's not. We need to reveal inaction in the face of need, because that's the way that institutionalized racism really works. And then 2 nights ago when I was doing these slides, I was like, oh, all of my stuff is over there from the point of view of the people who are inside the restaurant. There's some other things we do. We need on the outside of the restaurant to know our power. Right? We need to know that we have power. I learned my power when I spent 8 months in New Zealand, and they can't take that back from me, right? When I got out of the U.S. racial context, I was already a professor at Harvard University. But it took me going to New Zealand and being out of that context to really understand my power. And so I don't know how we're all going to know our power, but we need to know, each one of us, our power. We need to understand that taking action is power. So there is no place for just being a bystander or even being a witness. Being a witness is an important thing, but we need to take action. And we then need to understand that collective action is real power. So I'm going to end up with my story, and so she can't drag me off. Okay. Because I'm going to. So this story actually is not based on something from my own real life experience. It's actually based on an image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. So I'm going to illustrate that story for you, and then, well, I'm going to tell you her image, and then I'm going to embellish it to make it a story about how we become actively anti-racist. So she talks about racism for many people as just, you know, you're living your life, but you're on this people mover, a conveyor belt that's moving inexorably through racism and toward racism, and there's even a big sign that says racism, right? Okay, so, but most people are not trying to be actively racist. Let's take that image, and now I'm going to put us on a conveyor belt and talk about how we can be actively anti-racist. So here we are going to work, going to school. We're on racism. Actually, a lot of people are being rolled over by racism. So some of us are on top of the conveyor belt, and some of us are being mashed up by it. But for those of us on top, so we're just moving through racism. There's a big sign that says racism, racism, but we're so involved in our lives we don't even see it. And maybe we look and we go, oh, racism, and then we close our eyes. So we're in denial and we stay on the conveyor belt. Or maybe we look and we go, oh, racism, and then we turn around, but we don't do anything else. So we're still on this same conveyor belt. Maybe those are those of us who are colorblind, right? So let me suggest, here I have to get back on the conveyor belt up here because I ran out of space here. Okay. So for those of us, we're on the conveyor belt, going to work, taking our kids to school, whatever, raising our families. We look up and we see racism. What are we to do? Well, first, we do need to turn around, but when we turn around, we can't just keep on in the same way. We need to take a step, right? And we need to take another step, and we need to start walking backwards on this conveyor belt, right? We need to become actively anti-racist. And now let me ask you this. What happens when, and we have to walk at least as fast as the conveyor belt is moving just to stay in the same place, right? So that's some work, right? So what happens when you're walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? Well, you start bumping into people, and it becomes uncomfortable for them and for you, and they're like, hey, buddy, watch out, where are you going? Which is your opportunity to do the first of 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to name racism. So you say, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? Or will you turn around with me? Now, most people do not want to be disturbed out of their comfort. So they might say, well, hey, just leave me alone, right? But 1 or 2 may turn with you. So now you have 2 or 3 of you walking backwards on this crowded conveyor belt, and you keep bumping into people, and you keep naming racism, and more will turn. Never 50%, don't hold your breath for 50%. But as we get more and more turning, now you have kind of a critical mass. So now you can not only start at the same place, but you can start moving not just away from the sign of racism, but you can start moving to the motor that's making this conveyor belt work. So now here we are at the motor, and now it's time for the second stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. So I think it's this lever. So I'm going to pull on the lever, and the whole thing starts shaking, and I've done it, except racism is a very fancy system, so it reconfigures itself, and it keeps on going. Which talks about the importance of the third stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act. So as I pull on this lever, my health lever, I need you to pull on that pulley, your housing pulley. I need you to swing that pendulum, the education pendulum, and all of us need to take different pieces of this system, and I earnestly believe that all of us working together can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. And that is our urgent challenge, especially in these times. So thank you for letting me talk to you today. Thank you. And do we have time for questions, or did I eat it all? Okay, so questions. Okay, comments. Thank you. Okay, so this is how I'm going to do it. I want a question from those 2 rows of tables there. At least one brave person do a question from those 2 rows of tables there. Yes.
I want to follow up on Colin's comment yesterday and hear from you. There's many white leaders. I'm a white male leader on my anti-racist journey. What insights might you have for a room full of white leaders? Is there an individual that did something bold that you could point to, or I don't know, what words of advice might you have for a room full of white leaders, especially male white leaders?
Okay, thank you for that question. So I think that all of us need to be brave in naming racism. So we should let that whole word come out of our mouth. And so often we still talk about race or the issue or that thing. I mean, you know, I have conversations and people can't get, so the first thing is to be able to just practice in your mirror at night. So racism, you know, like let it come out, right? So because that coming out of the mouth, especially of a white man, is going to make other people listen. But so some people talk about white allies. I don't like that framing because allyship is a little bit loose to me. It's sort of like, I'm your ally, but I have to go on vacation for this month, so good luck with the struggle and I'll see you when I get back, right? And so we have to understand that racism is sapping the strength of the whole society, so we have to all be partners in this effort, right? Then the question, so really the most important thing that white people can do is talk about racism to other white people. Because I can do a talk, they could have given me 5 hours today, and you guys would be, oh, Dr. Jones, and all like that. You know, if a white person in a meeting talks about racism, it'll have much more impact than anything that I can say to you all today. So that's the thing. And I sometimes give the example of McKinney, Texas. So now it's about almost 4 years ago, I think. In McKinney, Texas, you might remember this story. There were some young teens celebrating the birthday of one of them in their neighborhood by going to a swim club in their neighborhood. They went to the swimming place. The other people who were already there objected to those teens being there and called the police. And what we saw was a young girl being dragged by her hair by a police officer, and then he sat on her, and then we saw the young black boys, you know, sitting on the curb, handcuffs. So then I asked people, how do we know that that thing happened, right? And people were like, well, social media. But I'm like, how? I didn't learn about how we knew about it until the day after, when I heard a young black boy being interviewed on TV, and he said, it's almost as if I were invisible to the police. He was part of the friend group. He had been at the party. He saw what was happening to his friends, and he could have run home for safety, but recognizing how his white skin privilege gave him almost invisibility to the police, he stood up and documented all that stuff that was happening to his friends. So when people say, well, don't give me white skin privilege, I'm poor, I grew up in Appalachia and all like that, no matter where you grew up, I know there's a lot of other systems of structured inequity, you might be poor, you might be this, that, and the other, but if you are living as white, you have white skin privilege, and so the thing for you to do is not try to deny it or shed it, your job is to use it, right?
Hi. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Freya Spielberg from the New Dell Medical School at the University of Texas in Austin.
I know.
And
I was supposed to be there.
You were?
Yeah, in April. Then I had a health thing. I was supposed to be there in April.
Come back.
Anyway.
One thing that we did at the New Medical School, which was really impactful, is they had mandatory anti-racism training for everyone in our department. I think they're trying to expand that to the whole school. You know, I've worked in community clinics my whole life. I thought, I know this, you know, I'm here. I learned so much. It really deepened my appreciation of some of the less obvious aspects. So I just would encourage every group to bring in an anti-racism training and make it mandatory because it's impactful.
I agree with that, and I also agree with history, that we need to learn our history. So we need to start teaching history, and we need to hire historians whenever you're trying to make a decision at any level. Find out, how did the problem you're trying to solve come to be that way? So I agree, anti-racism training, history. I want to not ignore this. I see a few other hands here, and I will get you. But is there anybody in these sets of tables who wants to ask a question? Yes. And then I'll come to those of you. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation this morning. We talk about institutional racism, but when we talk about structures in our organizations and where decisions are made and how those decisions are made, they're often based on values. How would you advise us, I represent a PHA, but we collaborate with many, many nonprofits. How would you advise us to work with organizations to change some of the dynamics in those value systems?
Thank you. The most important, so that's a very, very important question, and I think the most important thing is to partner with the real people who are concerned with whatever your work is. So even on advisory boards, or, so don't even develop a strategic plan and then go ask for advice, like real partnership. If I go back to those 3 principles for achieving health equity, valuing all individuals and populations equally, well, how are you manifesting that in your work, right? Who's really at the table when you're all going to the legislature, or who's at the table when you're deciding what kind of money you're going to go after, whatever. So involving people in decision making, and just, valuing, all the ways that, I made a list of like 30 valuing verbs: cherishing, investing, all of those things. So investing in communities. The second of those 3 principles was to recognize and rectify historical injustices. Be unafraid of history. And like I say, maybe in partnership with other community organizations, say, well, what is the history of this city? What is the history of your organization? How are you here, and who else was trying to be in this space who's not in this space? Maybe you edged out some, so that kind of thing. And then the third, providing resources according to need. That's very important. I want to say a few things about that. It requires, first of all, developing a metric of need that everybody agrees on. That may be the hardest thing. But once you develop that metric of need, also it requires political will to distribute resources in an unbalanced way. That is like, so if you get $1 million and you have 5 units, you don't give each one $200,000. Unit A may not get any this year, because Unit E might need all of it, and A might not get any the next year or the next year. So this whole thing of how do you really implement providing resources according to need? And it's hard because everybody thinks that they need, because they're only comparing themselves to people who have more. And people are never comparing themselves to people who have less, so they never really understand the true thing of need. So just those 3 criteria. Okay, so if you all had your hands up over here, can you stand up so I can just see? Everybody who wants to talk. So stand up, all of you, and we'll take you in order. Anybody who wants to have a question, you better be standing now, because then we're going to end. Okay, so I see 3. I see 4. I see 1, 2, 3, 4. Am I right? Okay, let's go. And I'm going to hear all 4 questions. I'm going to hear all 4 questions, and then I'll answer them.
Dr. Jones, that was so powerful. I was particularly moved by your analysis of internalized racism. One of the questions I have, though, is around strategy. Your comment about white man's ICE made me think about the practices that we have where we send our best and brightest to other schools, or we go to doctors outside of the community because in the community the medical facilities are resource poor, and we could go on, and in the housing context, deconcentration of poverty. So I'm very, very interested in your perspective on some of the short-term individual responses given the distribution of resources and the challenge of not being able always, or not being able to have the collective action to stay in community.
Mm-hmm. Next question. I'm going to take them all and then roll them into one answer.
Hi. So
please stand.
Back to your analogy about the cliff. The things after the cliff are easier to measure, so you know how many lives saved with an ambulance. My question is, how do you allocate resources or convince people to allocate resources to the social determinants of health when it's so much harder to measure impact?
Hold on, I had to finish writing my answer. Okay, next.
Good morning. What do you say to those who don't believe racism exists because Oprah's a billionaire, or Barack Obama was president, or look at all the minorities who are going to Ivy League colleges, et cetera, et cetera?
Hold on, I'm writing my answer.
Oh gosh, sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Jones. Thank you.
Good morning.
My question is this: if we don't get to a point where people recognize each other as just that, just people, and if that never happens, how do we ever actually eliminate racism? Right? Won't racism just persist if we don't get to that point where people just recognize each other as that?
Okay, so very quick answers to all of these. So the internalized racism. So internalized racism it's not innate. People are not born feeling less than. So as you're talking about, people internalize real differences in opportunity structures and real differences in value assignment. And so when you're taking your child, you want them to have the best opportunity. And maybe that best opportunity because of the computers in the school, or the teacher pay in the school, or not turnover, seems to be somewhere else. So at some point, we need to stop. I think we have to stop thinking about what I'm going to do for my child now. You have to do the best for your child now, but even after your child has graduated from college, or even if you never had children, or even if you have your children in a private school or public school or parochial, we need to be concerned, for example, about our community, our children, and invest constantly, always, in our schools. So like everybody's living in a neighborhood with an elementary, middle, and high school. So wherever your children were, or if you never had children, we need to be investing in that. We need to be thinking about, for black folks, the principles of Kwanzaa, the Nguzo Saba, the principles of self-determination, all of that. So I don't know if you, I'm not going to go through them, no, because I'm spending too much time there already thinking about it. But what I would say is we need to invest in ourselves, even as we're trying to do what we can in the short term, that our investment in things is not just for our family, it's for our children, our community, and we have to recognize that. And we need to turn the money back into the black communities, and we need to recognize the power that's in. Sometimes we don't even recognize what we have in our communities because we have so devalued ourselves and stuff. So we need to explore and invest in all of the things around us, and try to do the best that we can in the bigger context. But the thing is, like children, you don't have to try to give children self-esteem. People are born with self-esteem, and what you have to do is stop the erosion of self-esteem. You don't have to, people are not born with internalized racism, they develop it. You need to stop giving those messages and those real realities that are making people internalize that less than. On the cliff, yes, it's very easy to count the numbers of bodies, or even the number at the bottom of the cliff, or even the numbers in your net, or even, it's less easy to measure the pressure against the fence, but it's a little bit easy. It's hard to measure prevention, how many lives did we save? But when you really think about that equity, that health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved, it leads us to invest in opportunities, not looking for the outcome, not doing the 3-year to 5-year outcome. Invest in opportunities, measure our impacts on opportunities. Have we changed the housing status of people? Have we, whatever, and then measure the outcomes, the differences in outcomes in a generation, in 20 years. If you think about it, if you enrich the poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil today, the pink flower that's in there might grow up another 1/4 inch, but it's not until that seed falls into the rich fertile soil that you really see the opportunity. So I think that a lot of our political agendas, which you need a payback in 2 years or 4 years, or even foundations, you need 3 to 5 year outcomes. We need to stop that, and we need to say, we know that excellent housing is a good opportunity. We know that schools are a good opportunity. We're not going to try to see the outcome for a generation, but we're going to measure, have we improved the schools? Have we improved the housing? Just change our metric thing. For those who don't believe that racism exists because of Oprah and Barack and all like that, yeah, so there are amazing people who have made it despite the poor rocky soil. But the election of Barack Obama reflected the change in race relations for enough people to get him elected twice, right? But I don't know if you know that the majority of white people, in neither election did the majority of white people vote for Barack Obama. It was just the change in the electorate that got him elected, right? But even when he was elected, it did not dismantle the systems, the structures, policies, practices, norms, and values of racism. So people have to just ask the question, why do we see this still? They need to actually look at the quality of the soil. And if you don't recognize ourselves as only people, how eliminate racism? Well, I think the answer is not in saying, we're all people, so I'm not African American. I think that the answer is not in trying to The identities are not the problem, it's the differential treatment based on those identities. So we have to recognize our full humanity, but our full humanity doesn't mean that we don't have ethnicity or history or things like that. So I know you didn't say that, but some people do. Some people say, oh, if we only stop measuring differences by race, then they'll go away. Well, no, they won't go away. You just won't know about them, and you won't be equipped to address them. So I think that the real thing in racism is to value each other's full humanity in the fullness of it. Racism can be dismantled, but it's going to take children. I'm going to turn all of my allegories into children's books, for example, so that parents and libraries and all will be equipped to help children have these conversations, because white parents can't have this conversation with their white children because their parents never had the conversation with them. So when we change, that's what I'm going to try to do about the values piece. So I think when we can change the values piece, we can have our plurality, we can have our rainbow, but it doesn't have to be the basis of structuring opportunity and assigning value. So, okay, thank you very much.
Wow. Wow. Well, Dr. Jones, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I just want a couple logistics notes. We've moved back the agenda a little bit. We're going to bring down the walls almost immediately, maybe soon, right now. We do have, yeah, not yet. But we're going to reconvene in each of the rooms for our discussion sessions. It'll be an hour long. It'll still end at 11:45 a.m. But if you want to go out, get a cup of coffee, just come right back into these rooms. Please clear off the tables, because we will be, people will be moving into different discussions shortly.
So folks who are looking for data tables, you are in the right room. If you just look at the placards on top of the tables, you can see we have, over here we have student privacy that's going to be focusing on FERPA. We have someone from the Department of Education. Here at the front of the room, public health. In the middle, we have, thank you, we have HIPAA. So if you'd like to discuss HIPAA, please go to the center of the room. In the left, we have talking about education data with Seattle folks. And over here we have anchor institutions. So we have a great example of working with a university for sharing data. Thank you.